Okay, welcome everyone to We Are Change Victoria's Town Hall on climate change. Thank you to our viewers at home on the live stream. The live stream is sponsored by Freedom Free for All. Check them out at freedomfreeforall.com. They've got live shows. We've got live shows every Tuesday night, 7:30 Pacific. Last week we had Tim Ball on. This week we're going to be destroying the flat earth theory, so be sure to tune in. Tonight's Climate Change Town Hall. Obviously we're talking about climate change. Unfortunately, people have been brainwashed and terrorized into believing that an invisible life-giving gas is the greatest threat to humanity, and it is pushing all sorts of authoritarian agendas like carbon taxes, property confiscation, limits on your mobility. So this is why We Are Change Victoria is hosting this Climate Change Town Hall. We've brought the Honorable Environmentalist, Dr. Tim Ball, to give a short 45-minute presentation. We're going to go through the presentation. At 7:45, we will be taking a short 15-minute break. For those of you in the coffee shop, if you're interested, we are raffling off a silver ounce maple leaf coin for $5. You can walk away with an ounce of silver. So be sure to catch us on the break from 7:45 till 8, and then at 8 o'clock we will be taking questions for about 45 minutes, or however long people have questions. For our viewers at home, be sure to get your questions ready, because at 8 o'clock we will make a concerted effort to get your questions to Dr. Ball as well. So I think without any further ado, we'll welcome Dr. Ball.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you very kindly. Maybe I should start out by saying that I'm in favor of a flat Earth. The reason I say that is because if you got a flat Earth, you could push the idiots off the edge. Right? If you have a round Earth, they just keep coming back at you, and it's very annoying. I hope coming over here this evening you got a taste of global warming. I hope you're appreciating that. Global warming, another undelivered government promise. And as the global temperatures continue to decline around the world, Britain, the northern half of Britain is under several centimeters of snow right now, and they recorded a temperature of -16 in northern Scotland. So that's a month before Christmas, so it gives you an idea of what's going on. What I want to talk to you tonight about is some different perspectives on things, some context. Because so often what happens with these issues is that you get one little bit of information and you have no context into which to put it. And I want to show you some of the things that provide context for what has been done, how it's been done, why it's being done, the basic W questions that most journalists don't ask these days. And of course it's in journalism that the great failure is occurring. The founding fathers of the US knew that the fourth estate, the journalists, were the ones that were supposed to ask the tough questions and hold everybody's feet to the fire. But being the founding fathers, they had no illusions. Jefferson said, if you don't read a newspaper at all, you're better informed than someone who does. So he was aware of what was going on. I wanted to start with this slide of a book. It's just a very small book called Blue Planet in Green Shackles. I think it's a fabulous title. It's written by Václav Klaus. And Václav Klaus was, in 2 consecutive terms, the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. And I had the privilege in New York about a little over 10 years ago where he came and gave the keynote speech at the first Skeptics Climate Conference. It was organized by the Heartland Institute, and of course they immediately the attacks, they're paid by the oil companies and the usual nonsense. But Václav Klaus gave the keynote address, and his opening remarks, as a person who's lived through communism, he said, we've just gone through 70 years of communism, why the hell would you want to go back to that? And the place just erupted. It absolutely erupted. And Václav Klaus was one of the only world leader that dared to speak out about what was going on with the climate issue, and this book was part of that. And you notice that the subtitle is also very appropriate for what we're talking about, because it says, what is endangered, climate or freedom? And it's a very, very challenging question that he poses. I say, this is a tough book to get a hold of. It's produced by the competitive enterprise industry enterprise, and very, very difficult to get a hold of. But I thoroughly recommend it because, as I said, this is a man that went through communism. He went through controls of people and controls of governments to the nth degree. And so he knew whereof he was talking. And as I said, he was one of the few world leaders that dared to speak out. About 30 years ago, I was invited to speak at a very large conference in Bismarck, North Dakota. And before I do that, I've got to tell you one quick little story about Bismarck. I had a former student who still talks to me, which I take as a great compliment. And he had bought shares in a company that was literally licensed to print money. And what they were doing was they were selling at $50 a credit card insurance on credit card theft for the credit card companies. And he decided he was going to buy some of their shares, and he never buys a share without talking to the management. It's always a good idea. So their head office was in Florida, Miami, Florida, and he flew down there, and he got in the cab and gave the cab driver the address. In the cab he said, "Are you sure you want to go there?" And immediately my former students, antennas buzzing. And yeah, he said, "I want to go there." Well, they go off to some back streets of Miami, and here's on the second floor is literally just two rooms of this company with assets of about $13 billion. And, he said, it just screamed mafia, absolutely screamed mafia. And he told me later on, he said, one of the ways that I buy stocks is I buy what the mafia are buying, because they guarantee the price is going to go up, and they guarantee to get rid of the competition. And but anyway, he said, I was pretty sure it was mafia at that point. And he said, and it was confirmed for me because they called their annual general meeting. Now remember, this is a Florida-based company. They called their annual general meeting for Bismarck, North Dakota in January, right? And because they knew nobody was going to show up. It wasn't Vegas or any great place. He went there, and they were absolutely stunned to see him. And he said, hey, for a Winnipegger to come south in the winter, this is great. Right? Well, they got a kick out of that. But Bismarck, North Dakota, the conference I was at, the keynote speaker there was the former first UN delegate of the United States government. And one of the most interesting talks about what's going on in today's world, and I'll link this in with the climate change and what we're doing. After the dinner, he stood up and he held up a pen. And here's an example of what we're talking about. He held up the pen and he said, and he turned to the gentleman next to him, he said, if I sell you that pen, you have the pen, I no longer have the pen. His point was that in that transaction, there's a complete transferal of property. Okay? Then he said, here's the challenge for the next 50 or 60 years for the world. Because he said, if you have an idea, you sell that idea, the minute you sell it, it's devalued by 50%. Because you have the idea, but I still have the idea. And the challenge for today's world, where so much is service and ideas, is how do you sell an idea yet retain its value? Okay? And so, of course, as he predicted, he said what you're going to see is all kinds of legalities about property rights, intellectual property rights, and all of those things that we're now seeing. And he finished up his talk, by the way, by saying that if Shakespeare was alive today, he'd be in jail for plagiarism. Right, because he copied from everybody, and it's an interesting comment. And by the way, from an academic point of view, plagiarism is when you copy from one person. Research is when you copy from several. That's the difference between the two things. So that idea, I want to develop that idea about intellectual property rights because to me, it's as big a challenge for the modern world as the balance between security against terrorism, against freedom. It's another one of those very, very deep philosophical, intellectual battles that's going on. How much right does an individual have to hang on to information that they're then using to influence the whole world? And so it's a similar kind of debate that's going on. I wanted to show you this quote. This is a quote from Phil Jones. And Phil Jones, who was the director of the Climatic Research Unit in East Anglia. That's gone out of the public discussion, but that was the place where they were cooking the scientific books for the United Nations climate science. And Phil Jones was in charge of all of this. And this is an email that was leaked, and I'll explain later on when it was leaked and why it was leaked. But he said, I wouldn't worry about the code. What he's talking about there is the computer code. Because we still don't know how the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change computer codes for the models that they created. The computer code is telling the model what to do. Okay, it's a language that tells the computer model what to do. So one of the things they were doing was, for example, they had a temperature record that was going down and they didn't want it to go down, so they told the computer, hide the decline. And some of you might remember that phrase. They then tacked on false information to make the temperature curve go up. We'll come back to that later on. That was in the computer code. I've been trying to get the computer code for Andrew Weaver's computer models. But they won't release them because in the computer code it tells you how they're telling the model to cheat. That's what's going on. So here's what Jones said in the email. I wouldn't worry about the code. If Freedom of Information Act does ever get used by anyone, there's also IPR to consider as well. What does IPR stand for?
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property rights, right? So what he's saying is, if we can't hide behind the Freedom of Information Act, we can say, oh, it's intellectual property and therefore we don't have to disclose it. That's exactly what it's saying. This is 2009. Actually, this email was 2007, but it was disclosed in 2009. So he says, data is covered by all the agreements we sign with people, so I will be hiding behind them. What is he talking about? He's talking about data that's been used to create the false climate science that the whole world is going to be talking about in Paris at the end of November. The argument that CO2 is causing global warming and now climate change. So what he's saying is, I will be hiding behind them. Is that the words of a scientist of credibility?
No.
Absolutely not. But here you can see the information. I'll be passing any requests on to the person at UEA, that's the University of East Anglia, who has been given a post to deal with them. In other words, they set up a special person to divert any questions about what was going on with the science. This is like a PR person, a spin doctor. Science doesn't need spin. A minute they hire spin, you know what's going on. And by the way, the spin doctor they hired was the same person that was involved in the tapping of people's phones, personal phones, for the news of the world and all of that scandal that went on with Rupert Murdoch. Okay? That's the same person they hired to do the hiding behind. I got a brochure on the Freedom of Information Act from UEA. Does this mean that if someone asks for a computer program, we have to give it out? Can you check this out for me, Sarah? And Sarah was one of the assistants that was directed to say, no, you don't have to provide that. In other words, this is a complete email about how to hide information that's being used for an energy and climate policy that's influencing the whole world. It's behind all of the policy of what Justin Trudeau has announced as Canada's energy policy. It's behind all of that, and yet this is the scientist that was in charge of it. Some of you might remember the name Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton, of course, wrote Jurassic Park, a very good author into the science ideas of cloning and so on. And he wrote a book called Fear, which was a very interesting book about how these extreme environmental groups using environment for a political agenda, how they operate. Now, just to give you an idea of what's going on here, Greenpeace, when it was originally founded by Patrick Moore and Patrick Watson, had a very good idea, very good purpose to it. I've known Patrick Watson since he founded Greenpeace, and we still communicate regularly. But he told me that after about 5 years, Marxists had taken over the operation. He said, I hung around for a couple of years figuring I could defend it and keep it on track because we need environmentalism. It's a very, very valuable new paradigm in our way of looking at the world. But he saw Greenpeace hijacked for a political agenda by Marxists. And so eventually Patrick Moore just quit. Well, the attacks that went on about that, and by the way, typical of Marxists, you go now and look at Greenpeace, they've rewritten the history. They've written him out of it. Yeah. That's what they do. They write people out of the history. And so Michael Crichton, in that book, Fear, wrote about how they were using the climate as a political agenda. And it was part novel, but the science in it was very accurate. And people said, boy, he really got the science accurate. How could he do that? He's just a novelist. Well, the answer is Crichton was a medical doctor by training, a Harvard-trained medical doctor, and he'd done postgraduate work in England in medicine. And while he was at Harvard, he shared a dorm room with a guy by the name of Richard Lindzen. And Richard Lindzen, an MIT atmospheric professor, has been one of the most outspoken people. In fact, I'll finish my presentation with a quote from him about what's been going on in the climate field. But here's what Crichton said, and this is a speech he gave in 2003, a couple of years before he sadly passed away. He said he was asked to talk about what's the big challenge for the world going forward. And he said, the greatest challenge facing mankind is the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. Perceiving the truth has always been a challenge to mankind, but in the information age, or as I think of it, the disinformation age, it takes on a special urgency and importance. Now I want to elaborate on that, because one of the things that's also happening is that maybe I should start with a comment that I was on an American radio station and somebody phoned in and said, you know, America is the last bastion of free speech. And I immediately corrected him and said, no, America's the first bastion of free speech. It's the only country in the world in history whose primary purpose is the right to free speech of the individual. And they felt so strongly about it that they passed the Second Amendment, which the right to bear arms to defend the free speech. And what people get wrong about the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, they get, oh, the guns, and Obama's always saying, oh, we got to control that. The point about it was the guns were to defend the citizen against their own government. It wasn't about protecting America from outside invaders. It was about the belief that the Founding Fathers had was that somebody would come and take control of government and use the government against their own people. So the idea was if every citizen had a gun, you could very quickly form a militia army, as they had done in the Revolutionary War. And by the way, part of the Second Amendment also says that every citizen of the United States must provide free billeting, that is food and accommodation, for anybody in the militia army. That's also part of the Second Amendment. But that never gets quoted. That never gets reported. And so the idea of free speech, now what's the significance of all of this? There had never, ever been a popular revolution. That is a people's revolution. The French Revolution wasn't a people's revolution. Look how quickly it deteriorated. And look how dominant in France, if you go there today, people with the name D-E in the middle of their name, like Charles de Gaulle. What does that mean? Well, if you've got D-E in the middle of your name, that means you are aristocratic, that you come from landed gentry. And I'll tell you how crucial that is in France amongst the people. Giscard d'Estaing, which is D apostrophe because there's an E that follows it, he bought that name. He went and found an aristocratic family that had petered out, and he bought the name and registered the name of Giscard d'Estaing because he knew without that he would never become the Prime Minister of France. So the idea that the French Revolution changed anything for the ordinary people is absolute nonsense. Right? Charles de Gaulle, to show you the arrogance, he set up the voting system. And he said, okay, we'll have a vote for the presidency, and then 2 weeks later, we'll have a runoff. Because he said, it'll allow the citizens to vote in anger the first time, and then come to their senses and re-elect me the second time. He actually said that. So when you start to look at what was going on in terms of propaganda, so I'm living proof that Canada has no protection against free speech. I've had 3 lawsuits, all of them about nothing, all of which has cost me over $300,000 in legal bills, but it's purely to silence me. My lawyer says, stop talking. I said, no, if I stop talking, they've won. I will not stop talking. Okay? You know, it was a bit like when I was in the military. Another little side story. They used to do exercises in Europe where they would put Canadian airmen out as if they were to escape from a prison camp, and then they tell the local police and so on to try and catch them. And so you had to try and hide in rural Europe without getting caught. And if they caught you, they could not torture you, but really test you. For example, they could tie you up in a tree in the middle of a field in the dark and have the cows loose in the field sniffing around. You start to wonder. And what they found was that so many men broke down so quickly that the old idea about when you're captured you give name, rank and serial number, they abandoned that. They said, no, here's the way you deal with it. If you get captured, just start talking. Just talk, blather on. Anything. Talk. Tell them everything. Make up stuff. Let them figure out what's the truth and what's not the truth. That's what's going on today, of course, is that you just throw a flood of words out there and bamboozle everybody. Well, this is what Crichton was talking about here with the truth from the propaganda. And America, for all of its faults, has not gone through the final stage of the People's Revolution. You see, in England, there was never a People's Revolution. They never had a popular uprising in England. Why? Because the aristocrats were clever enough to appear to give power. Oh, you want a parliament? Sure, have a parliament. Oh, but we got the House of Lords. We can still control everything. Oh, and we still control all the property. And you hear them talking about, even John Kennedy talking about Magna Carta, 1215. A little joke about that, by the way. I took seniors on a tour. We went to Runnymede where the Magna Carta was signed. And the joke is that the American tourist showed up there and he said to the tour guide, well, when did they sign this charter anyway, in Magna Carta thing? And the guide said 1215, and the guy said, gee, missed it by 20 minutes. Sorry, that's a terrible joke, but we got to break the seriousness here. But one of the things that about the American Revolution that was not achieved until very recently is the control of information. See, if you think about power groups, it's the control of the information. Whether it's the high priests or whether it's the royal family or the landowners, Magna Carta was not about the peasant. Magna Carta was about the fact that they had a bunch of big landowners. The most powerful one they made the king, and the king wasn't behaving the way they wanted him to. They cornered him and said, hey, you're not treating us right. Who was saying that? Well, Prince Charles and people like that. Had nothing to do with the ordinary peasant and the private ownership of land and the access to information. Now, the internet, of course, is what has changed things, because the internet is the final stage of access to all information of every citizen, which is why you see people like Obama already trying to get control, shutting it down. What happens in those countries where you have totalitarian governments? They control the internet. But you can see the power of the internet and information when the people in Iran rose up and wanted to overthrow the government, and it was all done through the social media. You see the power of that information, and that's what, of course, Crichton is talking about here. So what I see is the third phase of the true individuals, and I won't say peoples because that smacks of communism, but the individual freedom. Protection of the individual freedom is the control and access to all information. Now that gets into privacy and secrecy, was another whole issue, of course, that now you see, oh well, yeah, you can have these documents, but they come redacted. Oh, well, we blanked out information. Well, why are you blanking out that information? Oh, well, it's privacy. No, it isn't. You're hiding behind it. I mean, I saw some of the stuff that Trey Gowdy's government got from the Obama legislation. They got whole pages. The whole page is black. Everything's redacted. So you want the information? Here it is. I mean, it's absolutely laughable, but that's the situation that's going on. About 70 years ago, a person that I used to think, H.L. Mencken, I used to think he was too cynical. As I get older, I realize that he was a realist. And this is his comment: the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. So they keep a constant stream. Oh, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. Oh, watch out for this. You need us to protect you. Trust us, give us the power, give us the authority. And that's the game that's played.
Bill C-51?
Yeah, Bill C-50, yes, oh yeah, absolutely. You can see it in all of those. And by the way, just a good point to throw this in here. Everybody's going on about Justin Trudeau, and they say, well, what did his father do, Pierre Trudeau? Well, first of all, he traveled through communist China, thought Mao Zedong was a wonderful guy, okay? And Pierre Trudeau was a socialist, but he knew he'd never get to be Prime Minister of Canada, so he became a liberal. All right? And then what happened? The people of Quebec, a true national group who wanted independence, as the Palestinians or the Israelis or any other cultural group wanted independence. And what did Pierre Trudeau do? Well, the minute there was some problems with the FLQ, he declared the War Measures Act, which took away the rights of every single Canadian. Took away your rights completely. And worse than that, he then called out the Canadian Army against the Canadian people. I mean, so that was absolute outrage. And yet here, these are the people that tell you, oh, well, we're for the individual, we're for protection of freedoms and so on. But whenever the people suggest they might not do quite what they want, I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, to see Obama declare a state of emergency and say, well, I'm going to have to stay in office for a third term. Entirely possible. So here you can see, by the way, I think that what they do is they get people shaking so much and so scared, the money flies out of their pockets and they go around collecting up all the money and call it a carbon tax and say they're saving the planet. This is a quote from 1994. It's from a book called The First Global Revolution by Alexander King. This is the Club of Rome, which was a very, very powerful group of people that wanted to reduce the world's population and control a reduced world population. And I'll come back to that idea a bit later on. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, sorry, before I go on with that, it's 1994, but I say it's shades of 1984, George Orwell. Okay, this smacks of that. So, and here's the key: a new enemy to unite us. See, oh, those guys are threatening. You need me to protect you. That's how they play the game. It's just like with the magician distracting you over here, meanwhile he's picking your pocket and doing his magic over here. See. Searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea. Notice this, came up with the idea. No reality to it. We just dreamed this up. This is one of those ideas. The threat of global warming, and that, by the way, is now starting to decline. They've already moved on to the next one on their list, water shortages. If I tell you that a professor out of Stanford University by the name of Peter Gleick is already talking about peak water. What does that smack of? Peak oil, right? We're running out of oil, we're running out of water, you need us to save you. That's the game that's played. And of course, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. See, it's you. You're the problem. You're the bad one. And it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. In other words, think like us and everything will be fine. That's what they're telling you. The real enemy then is humanity itself. Isn't that interesting? You're the problem. Because they want to reduce the world population so that they can control more easily a smaller world population. The Club of Rome was all about overpopulation. Now we get on to a favorite topic of Josh's here, but Maurice Strong, of course, was a major player in the Club of Rome. And Maurice Strong came out of a farm in southwestern Manitoba, at Oak Lake, Manitoba. He was born on the farm there. His sister has been throughout her life a declared Marxist, and that's fine. You can have whatever belief you want. You want to be a Marxist, be a Marxist, but don't force me to become a Marxist, okay? They came out of the dirty 30s, the hard times, and the suppression of the prairies. So there was a very legitimate basis for their views of the world. Maurice Strong left home at 15, and by the way, I've talked to people that were in school with him, that grew up with him, that worked with him, worked for him, worked in opposition to him, and every single one of them tells you that his great talent is he's the most manipulative person they ever met. That his ability to organize bureaucracies is one of the greatest talents that he has. And so when he set up, and by the way, in an interview with Elaine Dewar in a book called Cloak of Green, and Elaine Dewar, very interesting person in Canadian history, she was a true investigative journalist. Because she would say, oh, I want to write a story about this, then start doing her research. And she went wherever the research led her. She didn't say, no, I'm not going to pay attention to that because it doesn't fit my story, because that's what happens now. You talk to a reporter, and they'll keep you talking until they get you to say something that they can then put into their story and ignore the rest. I knew that at Winnipeg, if the phone went before 6:30 in the morning, I knew it was the CBC who'd read the Globe and Mail and wanted my comments about the story in the Globe and Mail. And they would say, well, there's a headline in the Globe and Mail that says this. I said, oh, yeah, I agree with that. So now they haven't got controversy. So then the next question was, well, so-and-so says, now they want confrontation. And they say, no, I agree with that person. Oh, okay, well, we'll get back to you. Right? You never hear from them again. It's artificially creating the news. And Elaine Dewar set out to write a book about Canadian environmentalists. Elizabeth May, Maurice Strong, and all of these people. And the more she did her research, the more she discovered they were more corrupt than any of the people that they were attacking. For example, Elizabeth May was a lawyer for the Department of Natural Resources about dams in Saskatchewan. She didn't like the dams in Saskatchewan, but they were being built to pond water to produce power for the ordinary people. So what she did as a government lawyer bureaucrat, she gave Greenpeace and Sierra and all of these other groups secret government documents. Nothing was ever done about it. Nothing was ever said. It was absolutely incredible. And of course, Elaine Dewar discovered this. She then spent 5 days at the United Nations with Maurice Strong. And she discovered that what he said, what he told her, was absolutely true. And what did he tell her? Well, she said, what do you think's the problem on the planet? And he said, the problem of the planet are the industrialized nations. And it's our duty to get rid of the industrialized nations. I want you to think about that, because Dewar thought about it, and she said to him, well, you know, that's a pretty grandiose plan. How are you going to do that? And she said, why don't you run for politics? You can't do anything as a politician. Probably the only honest statement Maurice Strong ever made. Okay? And it's right up there, by the way, with Conrad Black's. Absolutely, the more you listen and think about it, the more powerful it is. Because they said to Conrad Black, why aren't you in politics? You know what Black said? I don't need to be. I don't need to be. That's one of those little time bombs of an answer. In other words, what he's telling you is, I got more power, more control, less accountability, not being in politics. Okay, and that's what Dewar said to Maurice Strong. Well, if you don't want to run in politics, how are you going to introduce your ideas about getting rid of industrialized nations? He said, simple, I'm going to go to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. That's exactly what he did. And what did he do? He went and set up this United Nations Environment Program, and he went and set up the Rio Declaration in 1992. And by the way, just to step aside for a minute, in 1992, he also became the chairman of Ontario Hydro. He took over the total power control of the province of Ontario. He destroyed it. He stopped the development of nuclear power. He stopped the construction of more coal-fired plants. He instructed the building of wind turbines, to the point where when McGuinty ran for the premiership of Ontario, they were already having to charge every single citizen a fee on each hydro bill each month to cover the costs of what Maurice Strong had done. And McGuinty said, I'll get rid of it. And he got into power and he said, I can't get rid of it. The debt's so large. And the damage is so great, I can't get rid of it. And McGuinty ran a second time and still didn't get rid of it. Ontario now is gone from, because of that energy policy, it's gone from being a have province to a have not province. And what's keeping Ontario afloat? Transfer payments from provinces that are successful. In the great socialist idea, we'll nail the successful person and give it to the unsuccessful person. So Ontario's failed policies on energy are being covered up by taking money from other Canadian provinces. Now, what did Justin Trudeau just announce? He just announced an energy policy for Canada that is identical to the one that was introduced in Ontario. The outcome and the inevitability of it is already there. A totally failed policy. And yet they keep persisting in this. And by the way, I discovered very early in my life that there's two ways to get ahead. You pull yourself up or you push the other people down. And it is much easier to push the other people down. And so anybody that's struggling to be an individual, to have control, to control their own lives and institute change, it's an enormous struggle because those other people will be pulling you down. Well, I don't need to go through all of this, but at the Rio Declaration, the United Nations framework on climate change, he set up the political agenda, which was, of course, became Agenda 21, at which was set up the Conference of the Parties. Now, I want to introduce that at this point because the Conference of the Parties are annual meetings of a whole bunch of bureaucrats and people committed to the cause who control the politics of the climate agenda, okay? On the other side, and by the way, the Paris is COP21, so I'll talk to you later about COP15 and what went on there. But on the other side, of course, in Strong's very clever organizational bureaucratic system, he set up the scientific side through the World Meteorological Organization, which is made up of all the bureaucrats of every national weather office across the world. So who chaired the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Gordon McBean. Who was Gordon McBean? Gordon McBean was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment Canada. So now you've got the bureaucrats in control across the world on the climate issue. And so McBean goes to the minister, or whatever minister it was, and said, here's what you got to do about climate. And if the minister even dared to protest, say, hey, we're your experts, how dare you? What do you know about it? Strong knew that. He knew he could control the politicians through the bureaucracy, through this organization. Okay? And of course then, who provides the science for the Conference of the Parties? But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So you see how it's all very cleverly interlooped and interconnected. Probably heard this story from me before, but it's worth telling. And there was a group in here before you guys arrived that were working on conspiracy theories, and when I wouldn't say what they wanted to hear, they left. I used to think the commissions of inquiry were brilliant. And we all think, oh great, finally we get the politics out of an issue. Get the political out of it, get a separate independent commission of inquiry, and we'll get to the truth. Okay? I thought that until I got appointed to the first commission of inquiry by the government of Manitoba. And it happened to be a dispute over a lake, Dauphin Lake in western Manitoba. The dispute had been going on there for over 100 years about the level of the lake, the quality, access to the lake, and all the rest of it. And there are a lot of conflicts over water around the world, but I was appointed to this commission. Went to the first meeting. Doug Duncan was the chairman at that time, and he said, here's our terms of reference, given to us by the politicians and the bureaucrats. And I started looking at them. We couldn't even get the data. They denied us access to the data that we needed to determine the problem. So that was when one of my first major protests occurred, because I said to the chairman of the commission, Mr. Duncan, I said, Mr. Duncan, you go tell the minister, either we get full access to all of the data that we need to determine what's going on here, or I'm going to go to the media and say you're trying to predetermine the outcome of the commission. Well, the minister decided that that was a bigger threat. And so we got the information. And you know what I discovered? That over 100 years earlier, in 1876, there'd been a report to Ottawa about the lake and said, here's the problems on the lake and here are the solutions. And in the intervening 100 years, there'd been 3 commissions of inquiry, none of which had been acted on, because the commission of inquiry was simply a convenient vehicle for the politician to determine the outcome, control the outcome, and not have to answer questions about the problem. And how does that work? Well, then the media come along and say, well, Mr. Minister or Madam Minister, what do you say about, sorry, Commission of Inquiry, I can't talk about it. They're off the hook completely. And then they hope that by the time things come around, they're out of office and off down the road with their big fat pensions and so on. Well, this is what Maurice Strong did with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was a commission to look at global climate change. And almost everybody thinks they're looking at climate change in total. They're not. Look at their definition. This is Article 1 of the UNFCCC, of Treaty Formalized the Earth Summit Rio. Define climate change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over long periods. You cannot possibly determine what impact humans are having if you don't know how much the climate varies naturally and what the major mechanisms of climate are. But they're not even looking at that. They completely ignore that because it's not in their terms of reference. And let me explain to you an example of how these things end up becoming conspiracy theories. Because I was watching the television one day, and Justice Warren, who was put in charge of the Kennedy Commission inquiry, and they said to him, well, Justice Warren, why didn't you look at Jack Ruby and the mafia connection in Dallas? And he very calmly said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. I knew exactly what he was saying, but most people had no idea. In other words, what he was telling you was, he was told, don't go there. And what's the largest conspiracy discussion in the world today? The killing of John Kennedy, right? And so now you see why those things occur. So here they limited what they're looking at with climate to just human causes. Here's a simple little graph. This is from the 1990 report on climate, a United Nations report, and it shows the global temperature going back 1,000 years. And here's the current temperature. And this is graph 7C. This is the infamous graph 7C. And here you see around 1680, very cold temperatures. And then around 1100 AD, very warm temperatures. And this was put into that report by a Professor Lamb. And I had the privilege of Professor Lamb helping me with my doctoral thesis when he was at the University of East Anglia. Now, why was this graph problematic? Because starting in 1995, they were working on proving that human CO2 was the cause of the problem. Why human CO2 the problem? Well, you've already said the industrialized nations are the problem. How do you shut down industrialized nations? You could squeeze the fuel line, but people would scream right away. But if you could show that the byproduct of the industrialized nations was CO2 was causing runaway global warming, you could say, hey, there it is. That's what we got to do. This is what they narrowed down. And they were going around saying, oh, the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century is the warmest ever. And people like me were saying, what do you mean ever? The world's 5 billion years old, you know. And by the way, just 1,000 years ago, it was much warmer than it is today. Look at the graph. Whoa, we got a problem here. And not only that, I could say, yeah, the world's warmed up. It's been warming since 1680. It's all part of a natural trend. Okay, so, hey, what do? We don't go back and relook at our science. We go back and change history. That's what, as I said earlier, these people do. And here's how they changed history. This is the infamous hockey stick graph, where they took a temperature trend of tree rings, and tree rings aren't temperature, they're precipitation, but ignore that. And they could show, oh look, there's been no change in temperature for the last 1,000 years, therefore this graph is wrong. Okay? And this is where, remember earlier I said to you about computer codes? At this point, you notice that the temperature is going down. Well, we can't have that. Our story is global warming. So they told the computer at this point, hide the decline. Stop using the tree ring data and tack onto it the modern temperature record, the red line here, the blade of the hockey stick. Tacking instrumental temperature records onto a tree ring record like that is scientifically wrong. It is absolutely wrong, yet they did it. Because they wanted to show that not only was there no medieval warm period, but there was no little ice age either. Okay? And what about this blade of the hockey stick, this sudden rise in temperature in the 20th century? You know what they claimed? They said, our friend Phil Jones of the earlier email about intellectual property rights, he came out with data and said global temperature has gone up 0.6 of a degree Celsius since 1880. That is not normal. That's outside of normal range, which it isn't. But what didn't get put out there was that it was 0.6 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.2. In other words, the error on this part of the graph was plus or minus 33%. It's meaningless data. I mean, you wouldn't even use that for a political poll, right? They're the polls, if they're outside of plus or minus 4%, they won't use them. But here they're telling you about data that's plus or minus 33%. That's being used to convince the world that humans are causing global warming, and it's their CO2. So Michael Mann, who's one of the guys that's suing me, okay? And the reason he's suing me is because I explained what he did on this graph. And he's refused to disclose the computer codes. He's refused to show how he calculated this. Now, all of you remember from high school when you did math exams, what was the basic instruction? Show your work. Show your work. Because you could have copied from the person next to you. Okay, well, Michael Mann's refusing to show his work. He says, broad claims of academic exemption from freedom of information due to the proprietary nature of his work on the hockey stick. There it is, the intellectual property. And why is he suing me? Because I explained the hockey stick in Winnipeg, and afterwards I was interviewed, and the person interviewing me said, well, what do you think about Michael Mann? And I said, he's at Penn State, but he should be at State Penn. And within 9 hours I had a lawsuit. I had a lawsuit from an American, Michael Mann, filed by a BC lawyer on something that occurred in Manitoba. You want to talk about insane? How far they'll chase you? So here you can see what's going on. Just to illustrate my point about Michael Mann, this is the latest book by Mark Stein, because Mann also sued Mark Stein, because Mark Stein made some comments about him, but Mark Stein didn't back down. Mark Stein countersued. And you say, well, Dr. Ball, why aren't you countersuing? Well, the answer is I can't. See, because the U.S. founding fathers knew that this kind of misuse of law would occur, so they said they have what they call a constitutional tort. If you're sued, you can immediately countersue the other person. Okay? Here's yours and up one. Yeah. We can't do that in Canada. I cannot countersue Michael Mann. All I can do is claim that what I said was the truth, and I have to go to court to prove it. And as I said, it's cost me $300,000 in legal fees so far. You want to know why people just give up and go away? That's why it happens. So Mark Stein wrote a book called A Disgrace to the Profession. And here's the famous hockey stick. The world's scientists, in their own words, on Michael Mann, his hockey stick, and their damage to science. And notice, this is volume 1. I had dinner with Mark Stein in Washington last summer, and he said I got enough material for 2 more books. And I'm using the people that he quotes in this in my lawsuit. I'm in the process right now of sending requests for them to appear in court when I have to be there in February of 2017. Okay, let me show you some more of the corruption that's going on. This is the current temperature graphs. This is a mixture. Some are surface record, some are satellite record. And it shows you how corrupt this thing is. Because you see, what was happening here was the global temperature was going up to around 1998. And I said, yeah, global temperature is going up. Sure, global warming is occurring. But it isn't due to humans, and it isn't due to human CO2. But then what happened starting in 1998, the temperature started to level out and started to go down a bit. And so what did they do? Instead of going back and saying our computer models are wrong, they moved the goalposts. What was global warming suddenly became climate change. And I bet even you people noticed that change. Yeah. Even the media noticed that's how obvious it was. Right? And so you can see what went on. So global warming became climate change. And now people are starting to say, but the climate changes all the time. So they came up with a new term. 5 minutes. I've got 5 minutes. Better hurry. Sorry. Okay, I got a whole bunch of stuff here. Yeah, that's okay. We're going to get there. So one of the people behind all of this, John Holdren, who is Obama's science czar in the White House, he came up with the term, well, we'll call it climate disruption. That's the latest term for it. And here was the joke. The elephant in the room. 17-year cooling trend. Why is everyone snickering? Global warming science. Okay? And so the cartoonists, who of course are the most astute people, I love cartoonists. The problem is most of them end up committing suicide because they see the world and they usually can't cope with what they see. But that 17 years now is a 20-year cooling trend. They call it the hiatus. And of course, it's a problem. And you can see, the world isn't warming anymore. And the CO2 is still going up. So what did they do? They cooked the books. Data manipulation. This is from Professor Hewitt in Germany. He's a geologist. What's his world expertise? His expertise is on analyzing data sets and how they're manipulated and used. So this just came out the other day. From the publicly available data, Hewitt made an unbelievable discovery. Between the years 2010 and 12, the data measured since 1881 were altered so they showed a significant warming, especially after 1950. A comparison of the data from 2010 with the data of 2012 shows that NASA GISS, that's the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, had altered its own data sets so that especially after World War II, a clear warming appears, although it never existed. They're cooking the books. Now I knew about this because we had a lawsuit in New Zealand against the New Zealand government, because here was the green, was the actual record, and they adjusted it to the red to make the warming look much more dramatic than it is. We had a lawsuit in New Zealand about this. We've got a lawsuit going on in Australia about this. But every country in the world, including Canada, has changed their data by making the older record look colder, which then changes the slope. Okay, now this I want you to watch this for a minute, because this was done just this last year to get rid of that hiatus, the 17-year or 20-year cooling trend. And what you'll see here, this is the former data, okay? Virtually no trend in the data. And now hopefully it'll flip here. There you go. See, now it's changed. New pause buster data. There's the original data. There's the adjusted data. In other words, what they're saying is, oh, there's hardly any pause, but they adjusted this data to make it look like it's a much greater trend. They eliminated the pause. Okay, who did this? Two scientists at the National Oceanographic Institute in the United States. And what happened was that Lamar Smith of Texas, he said, citing confidentially, he asked for the data. He said, how did you do this? How did you change the data to change the slope? They refused to give it to him. What was the argument? Intellectual property rights, okay? Citing confidentiality concerns and integrity of the scientific process, there it is, the National Oceanographic Administration said it won't give Lamar Smith the research documents he subpoenaed. At the center of the controversy is a study that concluded there has not been a 15-year pause in the global warming. And that's what I've just showed you. And then more recently, Lamar Smith has gone back at them again and said, look, whistleblowers have told the committee, according to Smith's letter, that Thomas Carl, the director of NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, which led the study, rushed to publish the climate study before all appropriate reviews of the study was done. Why? They wanted to get it out before Paris. They wanted to be able to go to Paris and say, no, the pause didn't occur. Here's our scientific proof of it. What's been happening? Well, here's the change that occurred. This is the computer models. Here's their prediction after 1995. But here's the reality. That's why they switched from global warming to climate change, because the computer models were 100% wrong. And let me show you Environment Canada. This is what they do is they do a 12-month forecast. And then they show all of the previous 12-month forecasts that they've done in the past and compare them with the period from 1981 to 2010. In other words, how accurate was our forecast relative to what actually happened? This map shows you their 12-month forecast, okay? The gray is less than 40% accuracy. So over all of their 12-month forecasts, the Canadian average of accuracy is 41.5%. This is on their website. You could toss a coin and be more accurate. They're telling you, we don't know what we're doing. But the next day they're on the television with the CBC saying, oh yeah, we're going to be warmer 50 years from now, we're absolutely certain. They can't even tell you 12 months from now accurately what's going on. And then when you look at the precipitation data, and notice, by the way, all the focus is on temperature, but what's the precipitation going to do? Because that's important for farming and agriculture. And look at this. The Canadian average of their accuracy of forecast for 12 months is 34%. It's a joke. You would get an F in a first-year climate paper if you produce data like this. Certainly in my course. Okay, what are they leaving out? This is sunspot numbers. Sunspot's been increasing up to 1998. You can see here 2000. Now the sun is in decline. That's why it's cold out there tonight. That's why they're setting record cold temperatures across Siberia. The swans, the earliest arrival in Russia in 100 years. And what are we expecting the sunspots to continue to do? Decline. And we're expecting the global temperature to go down. But what are the world preparing you for? Warming. Preparing you for completely the wrong thing. And then you say, well, what about all the scientists? Why aren't they saying anything about these? The answer is, they don't go and read this stuff. Most of them don't read it. And if they did, they wouldn't understand it. But here's, sorry?
They're all bots.
Wrap it up? Okay. Here's Klaus Eckert Puls, the German meteorologist and physicist. He said, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measures. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. And what does Obama come out and say? Oh, 97% certain. But what they did was they took 11,944 papers and concluded 97.1% expressed an opinion supporting climate change. In fact, by their own definition, only 41 of the 11,000 papers agreed with their hypothesis. So the actual accuracy is 0.3%, not 97%. But you see that 97% 's out in the media. Once you got the headline, once the lie's out there, you can't retract it. And so this leaves us with the bizarre situation where the Pope is involved in the climate change conference in Paris. He's called himself Francis because he wants to associate with Francis of Assisi and love the animals and love the earth. The truth is he's a Jesuit. He's the only Jesuit in history ever to become Pope. And why have they not made Jesuits Pope? Because the Jesuits are the thought police of the Catholic Church. It was Ignatius Loyola that said, give me the child and I'll give you the adult. And so you can see that. And where does that lead us? Leads us to a Pope Francis. And by the way, don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing Christianity. Like George Bernard Shaw, Christianity is the greatest thing in the world, just a pity nobody ever tried it. What I'm talking about is the church, the control of the church. And here's Pope Francis visiting with the president of Bolivia. And what is he giving him? A hammer and sickle with Jesus Christ crucified on it. If that isn't the most bizarre symbol you ever see in history, there it is. It is absolutely... Okay. Sorry, and here's the cartoon that comes out about that, global warming, and here's Pope Francis, and here's Marx winking, I repent. You want to talk about politics making strange bedfellows? There it is. And so we come out with a cartoon. Here's Obama, and by far, I'll leave you. This is the Pope. The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Can you imagine a Pope saying that? It's in his encyclical. That's his pronouncement from his great big throne in Rome. And then he says, our goal is not to amass information, oh, don't let the information in there, or to satisfy curiosity, but rather become painfully aware to dare to turn what is happening in the world into our own personal suffering. And do you know who the chief advisor to the Pope is? A Mr. Schellenhuber, who's a climatologist out of Potsdam, East Germany. He's a pantheist. What do we end up with? Back to Mencken again. The urge to save humanity is almost always a false front for the urge to rule. That's what they're doing. The Pope wants to rule. Obama wants to rule. And our friend, I know I've gone a bit over, but just to finish up here for you here. Putin, they're so bad they made Putin look like a good leader. That's what they're doing. Who's this guy? Andrei Illarionov. Putin was not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. All right? He said he wouldn't sign it. It required 55% of the nations producing CO2, and without Russia's ratification, it wouldn't go through. Putin sent this guy around the world with a PowerPoint presentation showing what was wrong with the science. I attended his presentation in Vancouver. It was very good. Illarionov goes back to Russia, and Putin announces 3 months later he's signing Kyoto. Illarionov resigned. He's now working for the Cato Institute in the United States. Why did Putin agree to sign? Because they told him that if he didn't sign Kyoto, they wouldn't support his application to the World Trade Organization. He was blackmailed. He was straight out blackmailed. And now Putin's back to his original position because he's going to Paris and he's saying global warming is a fraud. Isn't that interesting? And so what you've got now are these 5 nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, 3 billion people, 48% of the world's surface, are going to disagree with the rest of the world. And they've already set up a new development bank to challenge the IMF, which of course has been used to control people around the world. The World Bank is a total control of the world. And so In Copenhagen 2009, COP15, Kyoto died. Why? Because those emails were leaked. And then in 2010, they replaced it with the Green Climate Fund. This is a fund held in a bank in South Korea where Canada's already put $300 million in there. Harper did that. I can guarantee you that Trudeau's going to put a whole lot more when he goes to Paris of our poor taxpayers' money. 2015 COP21 Paris, the conference objective is to achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate for all nations of the world. Paris is their last gasp at using climate to control the world. And so what do we have? Catholics, communists, socialists, the commonality is all using environment for control. And as somebody once said, politics makes strange bedfellows. There have not been more strange bedfellows than this, but then of course Catholics don't have bedfellows, do they? I had to sneak that one in there. I was absolutely blown away the other day. They had a Polish priest who came out and declared that he was gay, and he introduced his Spanish partner. And I'm thinking, is that priest celibate? If you're a gay priest, do you have to be celibate? See, only my mind would think of weird things like that. And this is why, remember I said about Richard Lindzen, who was Michael Crichton's roommate at MIT? Future generations will wonder in bemused amazement that the early 21st century developed world went into hysterical panic over a globally average temperature increase of a few tenths of a degree, and on the basis of gross exaggerations of highly uncertain computer projections, combined into implausible chains of inference, proceeded to contemplate a rollback of the industrial age. And that's, of course, was what Maurice Strong wanted. Got to get rid of those industrial nations. So this is my last slide. I apologize for being a little over time. I love the old-fashioned thing of, control of the world, war of the worlds, H.G. Wells. The debate is over. Global warming is man-made. The issue is man-made. The data is man-made. The crisis is man-made. And so is the consensus. And that really summarizes the whole thing. Thank you for your attention to me. Sorry, I went too long.
That's okay. So we are going to take a short break, and we will come back to Dr. Ball with your questions in a few minutes. Until then, we do have